What are some of your comments and your thoughts on the Commission's report about the RCMP?
I think today my first thoughts are with the victims and their families and the communities that were impacted by this terrible event. And I'm very grateful for the work. I was the minister at the time that appointed the commissioners to the Commission of Inquiry. I'm very hopeful that all of their very hard work over the past nearly 3 years and the recommendations that they brought forward will provide some answers and hopefully some comfort to those families. And I also believe that in their recommendations, they've made a number of very important recommendations on a number of things, including policing, governance, issues around firearms, incident management response, victim services, national public alerting systems. There's a lot in those recommendations that I think is very, very important to ensuring that these type of tragic events never occur again in this country, and that should they ever occur, that the response is appropriate and what people need.
What is your thought about overhauling the RCMP as an institution? The report talks about, as you mentioned, breaking up the RCMP, perhaps removing some of its duties. Do you think that's something that's necessary to make the RCMP function better moving forward?
I think those recommendations will receive very full examination by government. It's ongoing discussion on how do we ensure that policing services are delivered in an appropriate way and adequate and effective in every community across this country. I think it's still early days in response to those recommendations. I'm looking forward to spending more time with them. But we've been involved in discussions about policing writ large, not just for the RCMP, but policing writ large. And I think there are very real concerns about increasing crime and violence in our country, and particularly in rural communities. And I'm hopeful that the examination of the Commission of Inquiry will provide us with insight and advice that will help us improve.
One of the other recommendations is looking at banning semi-automatic weapons, especially that carry magazines with more than 5 rounds. Is this something that the Liberals would be considering? Is this something you think would be a good idea?
Well, you may recall on May 1st of 2020, our government, by order in Council, banned some 1,500 different makes of assault rifles, all of which were semi-automatic, all of which were of a certain caliber, all of which were designed for combat, not for hunting or sport shooting. And so in Bill C-21, we continue to further that work to ensure that, while at the same time we're always respectful of the legitimate lawful rights of hunters and sport shooters, there are some weapons simply so dangerous that they have no real place in our society. And we are committed to effective gun control, making sure that people who are intent on hurting others don't have ready access to such firearms.
How long do you think it's going to take the government to go through this report and to decide how to respond, what measures to take?
That report came into our hands today, and we've been through it. My team has been working through it. I know all the people at Public Safety. It's an exhaustive report. There are many, many volumes and many recommendations that are there. But there is an urgency to this work, and I think we have an obligation and a commitment that we've made to the people of Nova Scotia, and particularly the families impacted by this. These recommendations are important. I think they provide good insight and advice. I'm grateful for the work of the Commission and their recommendations. We'll work very diligently, and we've got to obviously engage with stakeholders across the country. That not just including the police, but victims groups, communities, our partners in provinces and territories and municipalities. I think with a particular focus on how we can make rural communities safer in this country. One of the things that this report really speaks to in a very clear way. But there's a great deal of work to be done. That work will begin immediately. Frankly, it isn't just beginning today. This is work that we as a government have been engaged in for a considerable period of time. But this report, I think, provides us with some very strong recommendations that will now receive a very fulsome review and a response from our government.
At the time of the mass casualty, you were the minister responsible for the RCMP. Do you feel now, especially looking at this report, that there's more that you could have done during your time as minister to put in place changes or reforms to the RCMP that may have helped prevent some of this from happening?
It was work that we had already begun under my predecessor, Minister Goodale, that was within my mandate, and work that we were working already with the RCMP in order to respond to. I think the clarity of our hindsight, there are many things that could have been done better in these circumstances. We knew that at the time, and I think there's also some very important advice within the Commission's report on how to improve police governance in our relationship in contract policing with the provinces in which contract policing is taking place, to improve governance, between those provincial headquarters and national headquarters of the RCMP, and between national headquarters and the minister and the government responsible for oversight and accountability of those police services, both at the provincial and federal levels. And so, that's work that'll be ongoing and form a part of the discussion that I'm sure my colleague, Mr. Mendicino, as the current Minister of Public Safety, will have with his provincial and territorial counterparts in the weeks and months to come.
Can I just get your response? There was one finding in the report about your conversation with former Commissioner Lucky about how I can't remember the exact words they used, but a poor decision on her part, but not partisan. What do you think about that?
It's on page 86 of the executive summary. Of course, I've read that as well. And I think quite correctly, they've concluded that there was no partisanship and certainly no interference in this case. And I know that there had been some speculation and even some innuendo about that at the time. But quite frankly, I think that's a distraction from the real issues that were about, many people lost their lives. This is a tragic event for the families and the communities in which this took place, and it demands the best response from all orders of government, from the RCMP, from all of us. And that's where we're going to focus our efforts.
After years of inaction and reforms that different levels of government knew need to happen but didn't, how can Canadians now be confident that these recommendations will be implemented and implemented in a speedy fashion?
I don't think there's any responsibility, higher responsibility for all orders of government than the safety of their citizens. The tragic events of April 18th and 19th of 2020 in Portapique and in surrounding communities is an event that can never be repeated in this country. We all are, I think, committed in our resolve to do what is necessary to keep communities safe. And we know that from this report, that there's a great deal of work to be done, and we're absolutely committed to doing that work. Thank you all very much.
Bonjour, Peter Julian, leader parlementaire du MPD et critique en matière de sécurité publique. Le rapport sur le tuerie en Nouvelle-Écosse nous révèle tristement plusieurs choses qui sont importantes, et nos pensées sont avec les victimes, avec toutes les familles liées à cette horreur qui s'est passée en Nouvelle-Écosse. D'abord, là, on voit l'importance d'une réforme policière, quelque chose qui est réclamé depuis des années et qui n'a jamais été fait. Depuis des années, le gouvernement savait qu'il y avait des réformes policières qui devraient être effectuées quand il s'agit des victimes, quand il s'agit des communications, quand il s'agit de la formation. Rien n'a été fait et la tragédie doit provoquer nécessairement une relance pour que ce gouvernement effectue son travail. Aussi, on a vu cette lien indéniable entre cette violence horrifique et la violence faite aux femmes. Et je remarque que ce soir, tragiquement au Canada, on va voir des centaines de femmes et des enfants qui n'ont aucune place pour aller, même s'ils sont en train de fuir la violence domestique. Alors, cet rapport du Commission devrait être vraiment un rappel à l'ordre pour l'action, de faire en sorte qu'on fait vraiment de façon sérieuse des réponses aux questions de violence faite aux femmes et aussi aux réformes policières où on a un besoin énorme. I'm commenting on the Mass Casualty Commission report today, and our thoughts are with the victims and their families in Nova Scotia. It tragically, sadly points the way to reforms that should have been put into place years ago. We know that this government has not acted on police reforms around training, around communications, around response to victims. And this has to be a wake-up call for the government to finally take action on recommendations that they have been sitting on for years. Secondly, and equally importantly, the link between this mass murder and gender-based violence is clear to all of us. And I note, sadly, that tonight there will be hundreds of women and children in this country. They're fleeing domestic violence and have no place to turn. This as well has to be a call to action, that the government has to take these responsibilities seriously. This is a horrific tragedy, and it has to serve for the deep-based reforms that we need in our policing systems and deep-based reforms that we need in responding to gender-based violence and intimate partner violence.
Thank you. The RCMP needs an institutional overhaul?
I think it's very clear that these are profound reforms that need to be put into place, whether we're talking about training, victims services, and the basic communications amongst the RCMP and often other policing groups as well. So it is very much a wake-up call that requires systemic reform within the RCMP, within our policing services generally. And what's tragic about this is that these reforms have been indicated in the past. We've had recommendations in the past that haven't been acted on. We cannot ignore these calls for reform and these recommendations now. This has to be a wake-up call to take action.
The Commission is also recommending that semi-automatic weapons be banned, especially ones that have magazines that carry more than 5 rounds. Would you agree with that change?
They have a number of recommendations that the NDP feels very strongly about. For example, licensing around ammunition, possession of ammunition, the purchasing of firearms components. These are loopholes that exist in currently, and these are loopholes that need to be closed. And many of those recommendations are recommendations that the NDP has supported in the past. The reality is, I think for firearms owners as well, to have all of these loopholes that allow for the acquisition or possession of firearms components, and ammunition without having a bona fide license is a weakness in our system that has to be improved.
Can I ask you, on the report and the government's response, today we sort of heard a statement from the Prime Minister that essentially came down to saying he would digest the report. Is that a sufficient response given the scale of what's happened, given how much we knew in advance, both at the time of the shooting but also in the public inquiries, for the government to just say today, we will digest this further, rather than to take accountability, apologize, or announce next steps?
I think this shows profound disrespect for the victims and their families. We have had these reports that the government has, quote unquote, digested in the past that have led to no action. The only way to respect the victims and their families is to take the actions that are required, that are put forward by the Mass Casualty Commission. And so it's simply not adequate for the Prime Minister to try to say, well, you know, we'll maybe do something someday. They need to take action immediately. And there are actions that can be taken immediately, and certainly, Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, we're going to be pressing the government to do just that.
What does RCMP reform look like in the wake of this to you?
Well, I mean, from the clear indications, not only in the past from the Public Safety Committee, but also from the Mass Casualty Commission, the idea of expanded training for RCMP officers, this is something that I think we can all support. The complexity of modern policing, the reality of reflecting the diversity of our country as well. These are all things that have repeatedly come to light in the past. Treatment of Indigenous peoples from the RCMP. These are things that need to be contended with. The first thing to do is to enhance the abilities of our RCMP officers by ensuring that they have enhanced training. Victims services, this is something that has come out of the report. And it's so clear that victims were not treated with the respect that they deserve. The issue of taking seriously domestic violence, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, this is something where clearly the RCMP failed. And this is something that has to be part of that broad-reaching reform within the RCMP as well. These are all things that can be done. It takes political will. We've had a government that has sat on this for years, and it's now time to take action.
Do you think the RCMP is being asked to do too much? Do you think that, national security, contract policing, all that kind of thing, do you think that it should be time to scale down the responsibilities of the RCMP?
I think we need to be asking more from the RCMP, but that starts with also providing an adequate level of funding. And we have to ensure, particularly when it comes to enhanced training for RCMP officers, that funding is made available. And I think when we think of the tragedy of this appalling, horrific event, for us to say, well, we'll save a little money and not put in place the recommendations that are so important, I think would be doing a disservice to the victims. So the government has to ensure that the resources are there to get the things done that we're asking of the RCMP, including diversifying, including increased and better training, including better communications, and ensuring that victims are treated with the respect they deserve.
There was a lot of attention a few months back about Brenda Lucky's comments throughout the early stages of the investigation and the crisis. Today, the Commission said that her comments were not partisan, they were just poorly expressed. Do you agree with the Commission that this was just poorly expressed comments by Lucky, or do you still believe that there may have been some political interference in what she was attempting to say?
I think I would tend to agree with the Commission on that. Yeah.
Can I go back to you on the guns? The report calls for sweeping change to gun control laws, and many of the recommendations mirror what is in Bill C-21, including a call for a legal definition of banned weapons. So will your party support that if the Liberals reintroduce the definition that they pulled a few weeks ago or a few months ago?
The recommendations also cover the loopholes, which I've just spoken about. There are loopholes currently in firearms legislation that we believe need to be filled. The issue around the definition, we had amendments that were put forward that simply did not do the job. They were poorly considered, they were poorly crafted, and the NDP called for the withdrawal of those amendments. Now, to put in place what I think Canadians agree with, which is a freeze on handguns and ensuring that assault weapons are not are used, put in place in an appropriate way. These are things that the committee will have to work through in the coming weeks. The NDP feels very strongly about closing loopholes. That's not the track that the government has taken so far. And very clearly from the Mass Casualty Commission report, the NDP has been right in saying that the issue of loopholes in existing legislation needs to be addressed.
I think I'm confused by your response. Do you support a standard definition of assault-style weapons that would be banned? Do you support the government coming up forward with that? The
government came forward with a long list that was poorly considered. Which was poorly considered, and the committee as a whole will have to look at all of the amendments that are coming forward. Where we certainly agree, I mean, the government hasn't offered a definition at this point that allows us to move forward. Where we clearly agree, and the NDP has been pushing, is the issue of the existing loopholes in legislation. That mean no, but it's important. This is very important, right? Right now we have a situation where manufacturers can reintroduce weapons that get around any existing definitions, and we don't have a process in place that allows that forces manufacturers to be responsible. So it is the existing loopholes that, to our mind, are the most important.
The definition is supposed to deal with those loopholes. So I'm wondering if you support a definition as recommended by the Mass Casualty Inquiry, as the Liberals had but pulled because it was so controversial. You're on the committee. Would you support a reintroduced definition?
The definition and the list of weapons, of firearms that were put forward was problematic. We are in favor of looking at the best way to move forward, and the NDP will be offering amendments to that regard in the coming weeks.
On a different topic, the Liberals the government appears to have signed off on the appointment of Dominic LeBlanc's sister-in-law as the interim ethics commissioner. Does the NDP support that appointment?
We believe the ethics commissioner needs to be above any reproach, particularly at a time when we are seeing more questioning of our fundamental institutions. So to our mind, it's not appropriate that we have somebody who is a close relative of a cabinet minister taking on that job, even on an interim basis. This is no reflection on the skills of the person involved, who has a long history within the ethics commissioner's office and has obvious skills. And I would suggest having those skills and having that experience, they would also be aware that it's not appropriate for them to assume the position.
So what should happen? Have you talked to, you're the House Leader, you speak with the Liberals quite frequently in your deal with them. What are you asking them for them to do now? Well,
we're actually putting the onus back. We have an interim ethics commissioner that we do not believe is an appropriate person to fill that position, not because of their lack of experience. They have tons of experience, but more because of their clear connection to a cabinet minister. And we think somebody who is respectful of the important role that the ethics commissioner plays should understand that conflict does not enhance public confidence and shouldn't move forward in that position. Thank you. Thank you very much. Merci.
got to ask you, as a Nova Scotian.
I haven't had a chance to read it. It's quite a big report, and it's today's about a day for us remembering the families and what they're going through. This is, I'm sure, very difficult for them, as every day has been for the last 3 years.
Are you concerned about the state of contract policing as a Nova Scotian?
I think, like I said, I haven't read the report, but I think there are some issues with regard to contract policing and the ability of the RCMP to provide the level of support that we need. You know, the fact that it took 45 minutes for the RCMP after they got a call to get to Port-au-Pic is a challenge, and 13 people had already been murdered by the time the RCMP got there, and he had already been able to escape before there was any police action. So that part of the whole process of the way the RCMP was able to support is disappointing, and the leadership in the RCMP is disappointing because we had the Moncton study afterwards, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of follow-up after 3 RCMP officers themselves were murdered in Moncton, and a lot of those things would have improved the response terms that might have resulted in some different results if they'd have been in place.
So go ahead, Dave.
Oh, yeah, just just on that leadership disappointment. The commissioner for the RCMP in Nova Scotia, he was saying that he hasn't yet read the recommendations. He's already had access to this report, but even at the press conference that was happening while you were in QP, he said he hasn't read the recommendations yet. Just what do you make of that?
Well, I don't know how long they've had the report. And he's also acting commissioner. He's only been in place a few days, and I'm sure he's getting up to speed on everything, including this. So, I think everyone needs to take some time to understand it. Some of the preliminary things I've seen, there are some issues around, I think, their interpretation of the firearms actions and whether or not that actually would have changed anything, because all of the firearms were illegally obtained, and I don't think anything so far that I've seen in the report would have changed the fact that he had access to them.
Is it time to go down to the 5-round magazine? Is it time to ban certain things?
Look, I haven't read it, so I'd like to see that. We do have limited magazines already on semi-automatic rifles that are 5. And I've been there for quite a while, since I believe the late 80s, in 89, after we called Polytechnique. So I think the issue more is, what is the process that led to his ability to get these firearms and get them from the United States into Canada? Those are the things I'm looking for to see what changes they may be recommending in the processes.
What does it take for the RCMP leadership to restore the confidence of the people of South Shore and yourself in the force that polices Nova Scotians?
That's a tough question. Nova Scotia has a mix. We have a lot of municipal police forces, and in my riding, the largest one is the Bridgewater Police Force. So the RCMP mainly service the rural parts of the counties I represent. And the officers that do that well. When they do it well with the resources they've been given, whether it's enough is an issue, obviously, for the provincial government. And I don't have access to the provincial government contract with the RCMP to know whether they are or are not meeting the service standards.
Last thing I got to ask you is, there's a lot of things in the report about support for women going through spousal abuse, women and children, calling for more money, calling for assists. I mean, obviously, rural Nova Scotia or rural anywhere, it's always a challenge for anyone facing that, let alone in a city. Do you have any thoughts on that matter?
We can always do better, obviously, and in this case, the killer's partner, I don't think had ever reached out to anyone, including her family, on her issues very much. So it's pretty hard for the system to help someone if they don't initiate it themselves. There were calls and reports of spousal abuse, and the RCMP responded, I think, as best they could, but I'm looking forward to reading that part of the report to see what they recommend for improvements.
Minister Ian, Mass Casualty report is saying violence against women is endemic in this country. More money needs to be spent on helping women in tough situations. Yes. You're the Minister for the South Women. Please tell me what you think.
We are reviewing this report. My colleagues and I, it is at the forefront of everything right now. Clearly, these are incidents that shook our country to its core. So we take this very, very seriously, but we'll be reviewing, just seeing it now.
The budget came out just a day or two ago.
Yes.
There wasn't any money for this in the budget, to my knowledge. So
there is money for the women's program, which we were happy about. It's $160 million over 3 years, and that money goes to grassroots organizations that help in situations like this throughout the provinces and territories. So that $160 million for the women's program will help in communities across this country to help situations like this.
But can you advocate for more? You can always get another program after. This is serious business for your...
It absolutely is, and my teams and I are always advocating for the women and those who identify across this country, and we will not stop. Thank you so much.
Mass Casualty report in Nova Scotia is calling for, says there's an endemic amount of spousal abuse going on and that more money should go to programs to stop it. What do you think?
Well, the situation with violence against women, and this, by the way, has actually been escalating with COVID, and in fact has not dissipated, and there's a crisis going on across the country. So there's no question that we need to ensure that there's a national program to address this crisis in our communities.
And national programs, do they actually work to, your neighbor down the street who may be in a really tough situation? Do they actually get to the individual people?
Well, they only work if it's properly resourced and there's accountability to it, and that it is actually led by the people on the ground and the frontline workers in doing that job. And right now, we're lacking all of those elements. Patchwork is not going to do it. We also need to address the crisis both in the immediate and also for the long term. And housing is a major piece for women who are trying to escape violence and for their children. And we have a housing crisis. People can't access safe, secure, affordable housing. I just met with women's transition representatives, and they've had to turn away people. Can you imagine how difficult it is for a woman to actually make that decision to leave the abuser, to take their children with them, show up at a shelter in desperate need to access housing and not be able to get it? But that is the reality. Can you imagine the stress of the frontline worker having to say no to women who are faced with that level of violence? And then, of course, many of them have children, and they need to ensure that they secure housing for children, and with the housing crisis, that is just not available. And so there are multi-layers to the problem. So when I say a national strategy, a national program, we need to understand all the different layers to it. We need to properly resource it. We need to make sure that it is accountable and that there's reporting mechanism in its delivery. Words is not going to cut it. What we've seen from this government over and over again is that they're very good at the words, but on the follow-up in its delivery, not so much. And lives are at risk, and we can't afford to let that happen.
On the doctrine, the discovery doctrine, what kind of changes needs to happen in Canada now that it's been repudiated by the Vatican?
I'm going to leave that to my critic to respond to that. All right.
Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Prime Minister, Doctrine of Discovery, the Vatican, what do you think?
It's a lot to digest, actually. I know that we'll be looking closely at the statement, and listen, for a long time, I think Canadians have known, and the government of Canada has known that the colonialism that Indigenous peoples have faced for over 150 years have had devastating consequences for communities. And the work that we're doing under the Prime Minister has been to restore a relationship that was envisioned by our ancestors so long ago, but it's slow work, and this is part of that journey, I'm sure.
Is it up to the Justice Minister to move a bill to rescind it?
Those are the kinds of deliberations the government will be having.
And what kind of impact could it have? No, it's an important question, please. What kind of impact could it have on treaties that have been negotiated on the fate
I can't speculate at this point.
But is it something you're going to look into?
Thank you again.
Is it something you're going to look into?
First off, we've seen some provisions for air travel in the budget, but one of the things people probably not going to like too much, the extra security fee we're going to see tacked on this. What's your initial impression of that?
Yeah, well, obviously during the pandemic, we saw some major concerns around the working conditions for security screening operators or officers at our airports. These folks are working under a tremendous amount of pressure. There's a lot of surveillance. They do incredibly important work, and frankly, the compensation for those jobs hasn't kept up. So we heard from many people working in airports that had concerns. There's work to be done there. There are improvements that are needed to airport security screening. The costs of that need to be allocated fairly. And what that looks like in terms of the contributions of the airlines, the government more broadly, taxpayers, I think that needs to be fair. And certainly we support changes moving forward that improve security screening.
Yeah, and in that fairness of paying for it, do I think that means, are you in favor of the idea of having that extra surcharge put on tickets? They were saying it could be like as low as $2.50 up to around $10 an airline ticket, depending on the destination and the airport.
Well, I guess the only alternative is that Canadians who don't fly, who can't afford to fly, would be subsidizing the security screening of those who do. I'm not sure that would be a fair allocation of costs, but the division of costs between the airlines and the passengers themselves, I think there's an important conversation there.
And of course, you have your private members bill going on the passenger bill of rights. It seems to have some openness on there of taking a look at things around compensation changes. Just anything you want to, any talks you're going to be having with them going forward on there.
Nice to see you.
Sure.
Sorry. Oh, Mr. Champagne, any news to share tomorrow?
Sorry?
Any news about any news we should expect tomorrow on Roger Shaw?
Oh, we'll take it day by day, in due course.
Is tomorrow the day?
We'll see.
All right, apologies, Taylor.
Yeah, no worries.
No, sorry, I sound like
you gotta see
how are we
the moment.
going to pounce on that one? Sorry. But yeah, of course, government look at, there is some talk overall in there in the budget about shifting the onus for airlines. Is this something you're going to be talking with the government more on through supplying confidence?
Well, it's certainly something that I talk to the minister about regularly. It was good to see some language in the budget around reforms to the current approach to air passenger protection. But the proof's in the pudding. The Liberals have had 3 years to get this right. When the regulations came out in 2019, they promised they were going to be the best in the world, and yet we see other jurisdictions like the European Union who have far stronger air passenger protections than we do. So I've put forward this private members bill that lays out very clearly our expectations in terms of legislative amendments, and we're hoping that when the minister tables legislation this spring, he draws heavily on those amendments and puts something in place that really stands with air passengers instead of always caving to the airlines. It's time to have a stronger approach.
So there's that Hannon Hutchinson report. Is it worth making that contingent on Hockey Canada to produce it to the Heritage Committee before you decide whether they get their funding back?
Well, the criteria with which we insisted that Hockey Canada comply with were very, very strict. And we're happy to see some progress, at least. So I'm happy to see that Hockey Canada is, actively trying to improve the situation. I have concerns about systemic issues in hockey, and the GTHL. I've been connecting with Akeem Aliu on that file as well. So I remain very concerned about hockey broadly in Canada, across the board. I'm not on the Heritage Committee, but I look forward to hearing from them, and we haven't seen the Heenan report yet, so I can't comment on anything hypothetically, but I do look forward to Hockey Canada's continued action to clean up hockey. The culture needs work. The organization certainly needed work and continues to, so I'm looking forward to more progress soon.
Are they doing enough?
To be honest, at this moment right now, I don't have all the information that I need in order to comment on that. I've seen progress, but I don't know if anything's enough. I don't know if I'd ever say, well, that's sufficient. It's a really, really bad issue and concern. So I look forward to more progress. And sunshine is a good disinfectant, so I look forward to seeing all that too. Thank you.
Vous pouvez nous dire au sujet de la Davie et M. Lightbound aussi, quand même une nouvelle qui est attendue depuis longtemps. Qu'est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire là-dessus?
C'est surtout du travail solide qui a été fait depuis longtemps dans les acteurs de la région de Québec. On est très fiers et très reconnaissants de tout ce que les travailleurs du chantier, mais aussi tous les autres travailleurs des fournisseurs, il y en a près de 1000 dans la grande région de Québec, qui sont là, sont actifs, puis qui préparent cette grande annonce qu'on a bien hâte de voir.
Pourquoi ça a été si long? Ça a pris plusieurs années quand même.
Ça a pris de nombreuses années, effectivement, de travail acharné de la part de beaucoup de gens à Québec, dont on a très hâte de souligner le travail dans les prochains jours.
Je vais vous dire quelque chose, M. Lightbound, sinon j'ai une question sur un autre sujet. Mais je ne peux pas vous empêcher de parler.
C'est bien gentil, mais sur la Davie, en effet, ça a été beaucoup de travail. Puis Écoutez, pour moi, je me suis engagé en politique en 2015 à l'époque, puis une des raisons, c'était de vouloir venir corriger une injustice qui a été faite par le gouvernement conservateur quand le chantier Davie a été exclu. Donc je pense qu'on peut se réjouir de voir aboutir ce travail.
Vous estimez les retombées pour la région, pour les employés, les employeurs? Qu'est-ce que vous estimez comme retombées?
C'est plusieurs dizaines de milliards de dollars parce que c'est un investissement qui va s'étaler sur plusieurs décennies, qui va créer à Québec un pôle maritime d'exception à la fois d'un point de vue manufacturier et technologique.
Sur les soins dentaires, pardon, il y a une motion qui a été adoptée à Québec à l'unanimité, une motion Québec solidaire qui vous demande d'offrir une compensation à Québec. Vous répondez quoi à ça? Est-ce que ça met plus de pression qu'avant?
Mais il y a trois choses là-dessus. La première chose, c'est que, évidemment, comme les partis à Québec, on est tous très conscients de l'importance des soins dentaires à travers le pays, y compris, évidemment, à Québec. La deuxième chose, c'est que dans les prochaines années, on va mettre en place un plan d'assurance dentaire qui va profiter probablement environ entre 2 à 3 millions de Québécois.
Mais ma question, c'est est-ce que vous pouvez refuser maintenant qu'il y a une motion unanime qui vous le demande?
Donc,
toute l'Assemblée nationale.
C'est une très bonne question. Donc, 2 à 3 millions de Québécois avec des revenus moyens ou modestes qui pourront profiter de cette assurance dentaire. Et la troisième chose, c'est comme le premier ministre Trudeau le dit, on va travailler avec toutes les provinces qui vont vouloir, dont le Québec, qui vont vouloir rendre ce plan encore plus solide. Et on a hâte de faire ce travail.
Ce que j'entends, c'est que ça ne change rien pour vous, la motion. Parce que vous me dites ce que vous disiez depuis 2 jours.
Bien, ça veut juste renforcer l'importance, de ces soins dentaires pour les Québécois, ce que les gens à Québec ont fait aujourd'hui, et 2, l'importance de la collaboration entre le gouvernement canadien et le gouvernement de toutes les provinces, dont le Québec, parce que l'objectif est de faire en sorte que ces investissements significatifs du gouvernement canadien servent autant aux Québécois qu'aux autres Canadiens.
Le fait que la CAQ, non, mais le fait que la CAQ dise qu'elle va mettre les transferts, mais le fait que la CAQ dise qu'elle va mettre les transferts.
On peut parler brièvement de l'intelligence artificielle. Avez-vous des inquiétudes en tant que député, en tant que citoyen par rapport à l'intelligence artificielle?
Est-ce qu'il y a un contexte particulier ou c'est on ouvre un sujet?
Le développement de ces technologies.
Oui,
vous faire dire peut-être n'importe quoi.
Il y a un enjeu important en termes d'éthique. Il y a un enjeu en termes purement juridiques parce que oui, ça ouvre la porte à une usurpation d'identité, plagiat, fausse rédaction. Il y a beaucoup d'éléments de ce type-là qui peuvent être nuisibles. Il y a les enjeux éthiques où on trace la ligne par rapport à l'utilisation de ce type de technologie-là qui progresse plus vite que notre capacité à nous y adapter. Donc, c'est une préoccupation générale, oui.
M. Champagne dit qu'il mise sur C-27 pour encadrer ça. Est-ce que C-27 va assez loin, selon vous?
Je pense qu'on n'a pas encore de définition adéquate de la notion d'intelligence artificielle, qui est un mot-clic bien intéressant, mais la définition précise ne permet pas de faire en sorte que C-27 soit l'outil nécessaire pour encadrer les enjeux éthiques.
À propos de la Davie, auriez-vous un mot à dire là-dessus? Vous devriez être content de voir qu'il y a de l'argent qui va aller dans les circonscriptions québécoises?
A priori, oui, tout à fait, que la Davie soit...
On va juste laisser passer monsieur ici, là. Merci, c'est correct. Merci.
Bon. Oui, a priori, parce que ça fait des années que le Bloc québécois soutient les dossiers de la Davie qui soient reconnus à la mesure des capacités de ce chantier-là, mais aussi de l'espèce d'équilibre et de répartition des contrats à travers le territoire canadien, compte tenu qu'en termes de performance, la Davie, telle que récemment redéfinie, est probablement le meilleur chantier au Canada.
Est-ce que vous y croyez encore ou vous allez attendre un peu?
J'ai hâte de voir l'annonce de lundi. On est optimiste de voir qu'enfin des démarches qui auront été faites pendant des années par l'entreprise, avec nous souvent, vont être couronnées, on espère, de succès.
Merci, M.
Donc, oui, je suis très heureux pour le chantier Davie. Ça fait plusieurs années qu'on attendait que finalement le chantier soit admis dans la stratégie de construction navale. Ça va aider aussi la construction de navires au pays, parce qu'on a un grand besoin. Et évidemment, c'est Span et Irving qui sont pas en mesure de tout livrer ce qu'il y a à faire. Donc, ça prenait le chantier Davie pour le faire. Et de plus, la Davie a prouvé au cours des dernières années qu'il était vraiment en mesure de réaliser des contrats comme on a vu avec le Astérix, qui, je dis en passant, a failli être annulé par le gouvernement libéral. J'étais intervenu personnellement avec, à l'époque, Stephen Blaney, qui a commencé une chaîne d'appui, finalement, au chantier Davie avec le gouvernement du Québec, etc. Donc, oui, je suis très heureux. Puis, j'espère qu'il y aura de beaux contrats octroyés au chantier Davie dans la région de Québec.
Le fait que c'est pris tant de temps et qu'on ait 2 provinces, Colombie-Britannique et dans l'Est, qui eux autres avaient des contrats, puis le Québec qui essayait d'en avoir un qui n'en avait pas, qu'est-ce que ça nous dit sur la façon de faire des libéraux dans ce genre de dossier-là?
Ben, la complexité, c'est avec la stratégie navale, c'est que des contrats pour garde côtière plus dans l'ouest, des contrats militaires chez Irving. Mais il reste que là, il y a tellement de travail à faire que c'est impossible pour les deux chantiers de réaliser. Et pourquoi que ça a pris du temps? Pourquoi que ça a pris finalement depuis presque 8 ans avant de finir par aboutir? Oui, il peut y avoir des questions techniques de négociation avec le chantier, mais il reste que il y avait la pression aussi d'autres chantiers ou d'autres personnes qui ne voulaient pas nécessairement que la Davie puisse avoir la possibilité de faire des contrôles. Puis là maintenant, ça se règle, je suis très heureux.
Pour l'intelligence artificielle, en tant qu'élu, avez-vous des préoccupations? Si oui, lesquelles?
Oui, absolument. Ça devient assez préoccupant. Ça fait quelques années qu'on entend parler que ça arrive, mais là, avec ce qu'on voit, les possibilités que l'intelligence artificielle a, qui peuvent être très positives d'un côté, mais le côté néfaste semble assez problématique. Et effectivement, on a vu là, les experts dans le domaine qui disent prenons un recul, il faut vraiment faire une évaluation et protéger la population parce que là, on peut créer n'importe quelle sorte de nouvelles, on peut même, au niveau universitaire, c'est un enjeu, commencer à rédiger les thèses de doctorat avec un logiciel, ça n'a pas de sens. Donc, c'est comme n'importe quoi. Hein, lorsqu'on évolue, on a des nouvelles choses, des nouvelles technologies qui s'installent.
C'est Jack Bauer qui appelle.
Ouais, c'est ça, Jack Bauer. Donc, juste pour dire, oui, l'intelligence artificielle, ça peut être très positif, comme ça peut être un enjeu hyper négatif pour la société. Donc, il faut voir ce qu'on peut faire, ce qu'on doit faire. Comme élu, comme pour les gouvernements, on doit protéger le citoyen avant tout. Et surtout, lorsqu'on pense que l'intelligence artificielle peut créer des fausses nouvelles, inventer, on a vu, je pense, avec le pape, qu'un faux manteau, là, il y avait de la... Ça ne fait pas de sens. Il faut vraiment voir ce qu'on peut faire.
La réponse de M. Champagne à ça, c'est C27. Est-ce que C27, c'est le bon outil? Est-ce que ça va assez loin, selon vous, pour
je pense que ça peut être un début, mais il faut effectivement avancer, aller plus loin. Et le problème, c'est que c'est des connaissances qui peuvent manquer. À un moment donné, lorsque j'étais à la sécurité publique, on parlait de cybersécurité, on voyait qu'il y avait un manque de connaissances d'experts. Donc, il faut vraiment faire affaire avec des gens qui sont à l'extérieur du gouvernement, en dehors de la fonction publique, pour des enjeux très précis et bien comprendre. Et c'est ça qui est difficile actuellement. Ça va tellement vite, la technologie va tellement vite que les gens sont dépassés. Nous, les premiers, au moment donné, on vient qu'on n'est pas des experts dans le domaine. Donc, il faut avoir la bonne information pour savoir à quel niveau on peut légiférer pour changer les choses.
On a envoyé 8 léopards de tanks de combat en Ukraine. Il nous en reste à peu près 74. La moitié de ça sont opérationnels. Ça nous dit quoi sur l'état des forces puis ce que devrait faire le gouvernement?
Comme ancien militaire, je peux vous dire que je suis très déçu de l'état des forces actuellement, que ce soit au niveau des installations. On parle même d'inspections qui ont été faites dans les bases militaires. Les bâtiments, c'est exécrable. Les équipements, on n'en parle même pas. Même des équipements récents qui sont déjà des flottes d'équipements récents qui sont déjà brisés, non opérationnels. Pour les léopards, on parle de la moitié de la flotte qui est opérationnelle. Encore là, pas nécessairement opérationnelle pour le combat. Donc opérationnel pour faire de l'entraînement, mais lorsqu'on parle de combat, ça prend des capacités à 100%. Et on n'est pas là. Et le gouvernement, bien entendu, ne veulent pas nous dire à quel niveau on est vraiment prêt, mais il reste que ceux qu'on a envoyés, je pense que c'était peut-être le 100% de ce qui était prêt pour le combat.
Fait que ça nous dit quoi sur la façon dont le gouvernement Trudeau gère les forces?
Ben là, pour les forces canadiennes, on voit que il y a des paroles. D'un côté, on dit on est fiers de nos soldats, on est fiers de nos forces. Puis de l'autre côté, on a vu au budget cette semaine qu'il n'y a pas d'investissement supplémentaire fait en défense. On a épuisé complètement ce qu'on avait comme ressources disponibles dans les réserves qu'on envoyait en Ukraine, puis on est satisfait de ça. Mais là, maintenant, on est prêt à faire des acquisitions pour donner à l'Ukraine, mais ici au Canada, on n'a rien. Les militaires se plaignent qu'on est vraiment sous-équipés. On verra là, que les forces aériennes, le F-35, ça finit par aboutir. Mais encore les frégates, on parlait de construction navale tantôt. C'est un problème majeur actuellement, les contrats de frégates. On est rendu à au-dessus de 100 milliards d'estimés de coûts. Ça va même pas commencer à construire encore. Les coûts explosent et on a de la misère à expliquer ça. Donc, ça fait partie encore des enjeux qu'on a vérifiés.
Mr. Poulos, can I ask in English?
Yes.
Okay.
I try to translate.
It's better than my French, sir.
Oh.
I just wanted to ask you about the appointment of an interim ethics commissioner who is Dominic LeBlanc's sister-in-law.
Yeah.
What's your response to that?
Well, honestly, we're surprised and we're not at the same time because we're used to have that kind of situation with the Liberals and their friends. But actually, it's something we can't. For us, it's unbelievable, and I think we must do something because it's impossible to have someone that close to Minister LeBlanc been appointed as the yeah.
Should she be removed? Like, what should happen? I mean, it's a bit astonishing.
I'll let my team look at it, and actually I can answer for that. But of course, we're surprised.
Okay, merci.
Bye-bye. Merci.